Hey guys, so this is AP World History, Chapter 31. Sorry you guys can't see the title, but I wrote it here at the bottom so you could see it. So this chapter is going to cover a lot of different things. We're going to look at the Ottoman Empire, we're going to look at China, Russia, and Japan, and it's important for you to know what's happening at this time because we're really getting closer to the beginnings of World War I. So it's kind of setting the framework in terms of knowing what is happening that's leading people into World War I. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is the Ottoman Empire in decline. Okay, so there were pretty much 4 main reasons for decline. The first one was a military decline. By the 17th century, no longer were the Ottomans expanding, and they be lost to Russia and Austria in a couple of territorial battles. Also, we see that the military is just not strategically prepared in terms of tactics and weaponry as well. And we also see a breakdown of the Janissaries, and there was little training with no weapon technology. So it's almost like they're still fighting with this old school technology. And so this loss of military power is going to equal a decline in central government, which means it's also going to lead to territorial losses, which is the second reason for decline. The Ottoman Empire will maintain itself in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, okay, and also modern-day Iraq, but it's going to lose territories to Austria and Russia. And also we're going to see nationalist uprisings brought independence to Greece and Serbia. And probably the largest loss that the Ottomans will face will be in Egypt, where Muhammad Ali will take over and claim victory after Napoleon tries to capture Egypt and that he's unsuccessful. So Britain will support the Ottoman because of the Russian fear of expansion, and we'll see this during the Crimean War when Russia tries to come in and take part of Ottoman territory in the Mediterranean. Britain will come and support them at that point. The third decline comes with economic difficulties. So the Ottoman purchased cheap manufactured goods from Europe. Artisans and craftsmen could not compete with this. Obviously, you're industrializing much faster, and the Ottomans just didn't have that technology. The Ottomans are going to export raw materials. They will eventually become financially dependent on foreigners, and they will take out loans. And what will end up happening is that the interest on these loans will take up most of the Ottoman revenue. So they'll lose a lot of money to giving back to pay off their loans. Finally, the fourth reason for decline was this idea of capitulations. So capitulations are the agreements that exempted European visitors from Ottoman law. And what that means is that you could go into the Ottoman Empire and you didn't have to follow their laws. It was something they were practicing called extraterritoriality, where the right to exercise jurisdiction over their own citizens according to their own laws. So if you were Britain and you were living in the Ottoman Empire, that means that you were following British law, not Ottoman law. And this was humiliating, and they saw it as an intrusion to sovereignty, meaning like we can't even take care of our own people, we can't even take care of other people in this land, in our land. So by the early 20th century, the Ottomans really couldn't maintain a bureaucracy, a government anymore, and we see decline in incomes and low morale, and that's going to lead to also corruption as well. So while a lot of people saw the Ottoman Empire falling, there were a lot of attempts at reform and reorganization. We see reforms with one of the sultans, with the reforms of Mahmud. So Mahmud created a series of policies to try to strengthen his empire, and some of these policies included a European-style army, secondary education for boys, such as focusing the sciences, technology, military, taxing rural lands, abolish military land grants. So trying to really Europeanize the area. Okay? And you got to remember that we are predominantly, having Islamic law here. Islamic law in the Ottoman Empire. So to move to Europeanized law is kind of crazy, and it's very hard to convince the older groups to change. So after Mahmud's death, the empire became smaller but more manageable. So the reforms that he put in, these reforms, they were positive. They helped. okay? So what ends up happening is we're going to see legal and education reform also. So defeats and separatist movements from such people called for stronger reforms. We see the Tanzimat or reorganization occur, and it brought stronger reforms, including Ottoman law becoming more acceptable in order to lift capitulations and gain sovereignty. And other parts of reform included public trials, rights of privacy, and equality before the law. Again, the idea of westernization occurring here. Okay? So even though we see these good things happening with these reforms, we did have opposition to that. And the opposition was usually like the old school conservatives, okay? So conservatives who didn't want change, who wanted to keep things the same. And this would include like the religious conservatives they felt it was threatening to Islam, these changes, that why are you going to change things? Young Ottomans, they were kind of in the mix, and they were not young, but they were just like a group of people who felt that there should be freedom, local autonomy, and political decentralization. And they called for a constitutional government, which was pretty big at the time because most of the power, or all the power, was held by the Sultan. So the Young Turk era, this was another group that was calling for reform and repression. So a descendant of the Ottoman bureaucracy seized power through a coup, and Abdulhamid II will be installed as the leader, and he's going to establish a representative government, and they're going to limit his authority. So essentially, the position of Sultan, or the position of being a leader, is going to change. And what this means is that you're only going to be a leader in word alone, not necessarily in your action. So all this is going to backfire, and he will actually rule autocratically, and he'll still practice those Tanzimat reforms, but his rule obviously is going to create a strong position because it's pretty much going against all the hard work that people have been doing. And those that received European education said the problem with the Ottoman Empire was that it was politically unchecked power. So meaning that all power is being held in this one person, okay? And that nobody is making sure that this one person is doing what's good for the rest of the empire. So we see the Young Turks, and they were probably the most active dissident organization at this time. And like I said, these people are neither young nor Turkish, and they wanted universal suffrage. These are the things they wanted: equality before the law, freedom of religion, free public education, secularization, emancipation of women. So very progressive, okay? Very progressive in these ideas. And they started a coup that forced Hamid to reinstate parliament and a constitution as well. And the sultans reigned but not ruled. So this time, what they originally wanted did take effect with the Young Turks and their reorganizing. And we see Turkish hegemony in the empire. So tensions grew between Turkish rulers and the subject peoples outside Anatolia. And again, these are people who are not necessarily Turkish, nor even practice necessarily the same ideologies as them. So that's essentially what's happening with the Ottoman Empire. It's definitely contracting. It's pretty much reaching its end. It will definitely end at the end of World War I. Now we're going to move to the Russian Empire. So with the Russian Empire, we see a military defeat and social tension, and it begins with the Crimean War. Now, we talked about how the British were helping the Ottomans to help control Russia, and they did that for a reason, because they felt Russia was threatening. And Russia will expand in 3 directions: east to Manchuria, south into the Caucasus and Central Asia, and then southwest to the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean interfered with the Ottoman Empire's territories, causing an imbalance. So pretty much the Russians were going into territories that weren't theirs, and that's really why the British came and helped them. And this will start the Crimean War, which was between the Russians versus the British, French, and Sardinian Ottoman Empire. All worked together to stop the Russians from coming in. And they were successful, okay? So it worked for them. They won the war. And what this showed the Russians was that they were weak militarily, and that they were weak because they had an agrarian economy. So it was really still that farm-based economy. And remember, everybody else in Europe is industrialized. So for them to have a farm-based economy, so it's like, you're bringing, your bows and arrows to a gunfight, and it's like not going to work. So they figured out that they needed some restructuring. So one of the first things they did was they emancipated the serfs, because they still had this idea of serfdom where people were still working the land that they were bound to. And they felt the key to social reform was this emancipation of the serfs, was getting the serfs away. So economically, it was inefficient. It didn't necessarily work because it still created rural instability, and the peasants began to revolt because they didn't have land. They weren't being taken care of. So Tsar Alexander in 1861 officially will abolish serfdom, but unofficially will be practiced for decades after. So yes, you're free, but not really, because you have no other form of work. So governments provided compensation for land and serf, but again, they still did not have enough. It wasn't enough to survive. So peasants had few rights and had to pay redemption tax for the land. And again, how are you going to pay redemption tax when you have no money, when you have no job? So emancipation brought little agricultural production. So this was not necessarily successful in helping to reorganize the Russians. So political and legal reform, other reforms that came after serfdom were something called the Zemstvos. And so essentially what it was like assemblies that would address health, education, and welfare. And Zemstvos were subordinate to the Tsar. So whatever the Tsar said, that's what the Zemstvos did. They also saw a revision of judiciary system based on European models, trial by jury, elected justices of the peace, judicial reform, created attorney, and less corruption. So again, the idea of trying to westernize through the legal system. Through legality. Okay? And we see that a lot in almost all of the areas we're going to look at. So how are we going to industrialize? How are we going to show that we are as strong as the Europeans? One of the ways they did it was something called the WIT system, or the VEET system. The difference for industrialization in Europe was more political and military than entrepreneurial. And what that means is that the reasons for the Russians to go into industrialization was for these reasons. All right? Were political and military reasons. So how do we do that? Well, Sergei Witt, he was the one who really figured out what to do. He was the Prime Minister of Finance, and he pushed for this industrialization. He said it's going to stimulate the economy, and we're going to do this through creating a railway construction. So Witt remodeled the state bank. He encouraged savings banks, supported new industries through tariffs, and secured large loans from Western Europe for industrialization. So he did all these things, and his changes were successful. So all of this worked, but it had repercussions like industrial discontent. Okay, so and what this meant was that yes, we're industrializing, we're doing this, but you're forgetting about the people. You're forgetting about these people. So low standards of living for workers created rebellions and strikes because you're getting paid terrible, you're working terrible conditions, and growth of new working class was similar to those that started in Western Europe much earlier, but the government did not allow trade unions or strikes. And it's kind of similar to what you saw in Europe, in Western Europe, but not really, because eventually you did have trade unions. So exploitation and lack of political freedom led workers to buy into revolutionary propaganda and underground movements. So because they were so upset, it's going to equal them going into this propaganda and underground movements and buying into them. And so the Russian business owners often did not challenge the Tsar in what he wanted, and they kept things the same. So next we're going to see repression and revolution, and with protests. So the last 3 decades of the 19th century for the Russians led to many protests, in particular because of the really bad working conditions, because peasants had a lack of land. Again, like I said, the poor conditions. You had something called the Intelligentsia, which was a group that called for political reform and social change. And many that were for reform were anarchists. They wanted to just get rid of the government completely and just practice on true individual freedom. So that was one thing that was going on, because they weren't being taken care of with industrialization. Another thing we see is repression. So kind of in response to the protest, okay, we see the repression happen. And anarchists will go to the countryside to push their agenda and get people to follow them. The Tsar will begin to repress things by censoring publications and having secret police to find out who's doing, these protests and who's having people go against the government. And it will make anarchists even more radical in their actions. And the Tsar also will have frequent pogroms, which are anti-Jewish riots, to go against the Jewish sentiment and anybody who was also protesting through that way. We also see terrorism during this time. In 1876, the Land and Freedom Party promoted assassinations in order for political change to occur. Tsar Nicholas II takes the throne, and he will try to, settle things down. But to distract from internal insurrection, he attempts to expand east into Korea. So this is kind of like this whole expanding into Korea and Manchuria, this is like a distractor. Okay, so forget the problems here that's happening at home and let me distract you by trying to go in and take over this area. And Japan also has the same intention in going in and taking over Korea, Manchuria. So we see the Russo-Japanese War starts, and the Russians will lose by a surprise attack from Japan. And this will lead into the revolution of 1905. So during this time, things are really just not good at all for Russia. There's a lot of internal unrest that will lead to the revolution, that will lead to the Russian Revolution. And it's because of labor unrest, peasant insurrection, student protests, and mutinies. All of this adds to the revolution. Okay? Adds to revolution. So urban workers create councils called Soviets to organize strikes and deal with employers during this time. And that's kind of where we get the term the Soviet Union. Before we got Russia, it was called the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. And the revolution will force the government to make changes. So it's going to create the first elected assembly called the Duma. So which means that we're getting rid of monarchy. So get rid of king and open up to legislative body. Legislative body. Okay? And even though this happened, it still doesn't end much, but it's going to be another point to where the Russians can turn. All right, so now we're going to look at China under siege, and this has a lot to do with other countries kind of coming in and taking over China in a kind of economic way. So it first starts with the Opium War and the unequal treaties. The opium trade is really what is going to be the downfall for China. So the British are trying to seek more profits from China, and what they did is they will turn to opium to trade with China. So they'll make it in India, they'll sell it to the Chinese will pay them for it, and then they'll use that money that they get from China to go and buy Chinese goods, if that makes any sense. So it's like make in India, and then we're going to get money from that, and then we're going to, buy Chinese goods. So the East Indian Company easily paid for Chinese products through this exchange. Opium trade was illegal, but there's no sign of enforcement, so people are still buying. And opium affected China negatively, both economically and socially. And Commissioner Ling Zezhu attempted to stop opium trade, but faced defeat. And he was really, a staunch opponent on that. And he tried his best to really stop it, but it just didn't work. So the British are upset at this, attempt at stopping it. And it's going to halt. The British upset at this halt in opium, and it will and they will begin to trade using military force. So pretty much the British are forcing them to open trade with them. And this is clear evidence of the difference in military power between Europe and China. Again, Europe is just way stronger, And the British will attack the Chinese Grand Canal, and this will pretty much be where China's like, all right, I'm done. We surrender. We give in to whatever you want. And China will call for peace after this. So after this, we're going to see unequal treaties that develop between Britain and China. Okay? And China will be the one to suffer more of the loss. So after these confrontations came the unequal treaties, and they were treaties that shook the sovereignty of China. So the first one was the Treaty of Nanjing, and it gave Hong Kong Island to Great Britain. It opened 5 Chinese ports. It gave Great Britain most favored nation status and granted extraterritoriality. So you're going to open your island. You're going to give us 5 Chinese ports. You're going to say that we're like the preferred nation you want to trade with. And anybody who lives in China who's a British citizen doesn't have to follow your rules. Other countries would also impose unequal treaties on China as well. And by 1990, Chinese ports were under foreign control. 90 of them. So most of the ports in China did not belong to China. These treaties also dismantled the tributary system of Korea, Vietnam, and Burma as well. So they no longer relied on these people to give them tribute. So understanding everything that was happening, a lot of the citizens were very upset, and we see the Taiping Rebellion eventually come into play. But first we see the Taiping Program. So rebellions reflected poverty and discontent by the Chinese peasants. So it wasn't that it was just about, the unequal treaties. There was already a lot of internal conflict going on in China. And one of them was this unequal land distribution. This was one reason that people were upset. Corruption in government and drug addiction to opium was another reason. So what ends up happening is that Hong Xiuquan called for the eradication of the Qin dynasty, saying, you're no longer taking care of the people. Because of that, you should lose the mandate. And the peasants, and only on top of that, but another reason is that the peasants didn't like the Manchus because they were foreigners. Okay, they were the foreign ruling them. So the Taiping Program called for reform for the abolition of private property. That was 1. Communal wealth. 2. Prohibition of foot binding and concubinage. 3. And free education and simplified written language and literacy. So all these reforms they wanted. And the Taipings declared equality for men and women as well. And they gained a lot of support through the countryside, and an attempt to overthrow the Qin was made, but it was put down. So this was never really put in place. And what ends up happening is that the Chinese gentry are going to side with the government because they want to keep things the same. The Qin dynasty gathered regional Chinese armies instead of the Manchus. And the Qing also used European weapons and overcame the Taiping Rebellion, and it was going to prove costly. And a lot of people will die, and a lot of the agricultural production will come into a decline because of that. So we see reform frustration as well. The self-strengthening movement, and what this was an attempt for change was needed. So they started something called the self-strengthening movement. And what it did was it raised troops, it levied taxes, run the bureaucracy, promote economic and military reform, and it tried to blend tradition with European industrial technology. And it'll lay the foundation for industrialization. And the movement was not successful due to the contradiction of thought. The idea that we're becoming Western, we're westernizing, but we are keeping values. We are keeping the same values, like Confucianism. So it didn't work. They didn't equal each other out. The spheres of influence will end the tributary system, allowed Europeans to take its place through colonial rule. We also see France will get Vietnam. Great Britain got Burma. European power to much influence over China. The 100 Days Reform also came about, and it was a series of treaties that reinterpreted Confucian thought into radical ideas, and it wanted to make China into a powerful industry. So Emperor Zhangzhou transformed China into a constitutional monarchy, and it had civil liberties and to take out the corruption and encourage foreign influence. All reforms were nullified. So we see, this reform was an attempt, but not necessarily the best. This one did not work either. And the Boxer Rebellion comes about because the Boxers wanted to get rid of the foreign influence in China. They felt they were the ones that are really hurting the Chinese thought. And they went on a rampage killing foreigners and Chinese Christians. And they thought they could defeat the foreign powers if they attacked the embassies. But that wasn't the case because the U.S. and the other foreigners quickly came in and defeated the Chinese and made them pay for the damages. And this was a harsh blow to the Qin dynasty. Okay, the next group we're going to look at, and the last country, is going to be Japan. So from Tokugawa to Meiji, we see the crisis and reform. So agricultural production will drop. There's going to be crop failure, famines, taxes, and economic hardship are going to all be problems in Japan. And obviously, this is going to lead to a lot of rebellion. So the Tokugawa government responded with conservative reforms that didn't change much. So it didn't help. It wasn't effective. In addition to this, we see foreign pressure, especially from the United States. So the foreigners insisted on diplomatic and commercial relations with Japan. Pretty much, they just want to trade. Open your ports up for trade. And Japan is going to say no first. So what ends up happening is the U.S. pretty much says, well, if you're not going to open up, then we're going to force you to open up your trade ports with us. And, well, just like China, Japan says, okay, we're going to do that then, because we cannot fight and win a battle against you. And this will become the end of Tokugawa rule. And the entrance of foreigners led to the end of it. And this brought internal opposition to Tokugawa. And it'll also bring in the beginning of the Meiji reform. This is super important. So Tokugawa attempted to fight back their opposition by firing the daimyo or executing or firing the samurai. The Tokugawa shogun will resign, and a boy emperor, also known as Meiji, will take power at one of the most important times in Japanese history, and he will really transform Japan. So the Meiji reforms, these were foreign influences. We first see Fukazawa Yukichi and Ito Hirobumi, a prominent Meiji-era travelers. They went to Europe. They pretty much learned everything about westernizing. And he lauded over constitutional government, a modern educational system, and it would inspire Japanese political change. So the Meiji central political power gets rid of the social order. They'll abolish the samurai class. They'll get rid of the daimyo. The samurai got rid of swords and topknots as well. And Japan will create a new tax system. And the Meiji converted from a grain tax to a fixed money tax and found a way to predict profitability based on arable land. In addition to these Meiji reforms, you see the development of a constitutional government. And the Meiji era created something known as the Diet. So it's a constitution almost just in word alone. The Constitution limited the authority of the Diet and gave much more of the power to the executive branch, meaning that, yes, we're a legislative body, but in the end, the emperor has the right to dissolve the parliament. The parliament is basically an advisor to the emperor. And individual rights, but laws could limit rights as well. In terms of remodeling the economy, we see a powerful economy, and that's going to equal national strength. Modern transportation, communication, and infrastructure will develop. Telegraphs, railroads, and steamships are also introduced, and as well as primary and secondary education. Universities for the best students, especially science and technology. All this created rapid industrialization and economic growth, and it's what's going to begin to make Japan a superpower. So the costs of economic development, the Japanese peasant did much to speed up industrialization. Land tax provided 90% of the revenue, and peasant uprisings began to grow because they were working so hard, but they weren't seeing the benefit of it. Labor unions and strikes were criminal, so you're kind of suppressing that part. And in one generation, this is huge, in one generation, Meiji transformed Japan into a powerful industrial society, and they wanted to be seen as economic equals with the US and Europe. The accomplishments due to industrialization, ending extraterritoriality with Britain, military power over China and Russia. So what does this all mean? So for the Ottomans, remember, they are in decline. All right, they lose territory. Their land contracts. For Russia, they are trying to industrialize. Little success. See little success. Loss in Crimean War. Peasant uprisings. As well. With China, we see unequal treaties. Because of the Opium War, loss in the Opium War. Pretty much, European powers take over. Economically. Then with Japan, the biggest thing you have to know here is by opening ports to trade with the West, they industrialize. And this industrialization will mean probably that they're like the superpower of the East at this point. But the whole industrialize, that's huge. And that is because of the Meiji reforms. All right, so that's chapter 31. Hopefully it makes sense. Like I said, it's really important for you to know where all the players stand, especially when you go into reading the next few chapters, because we will not see each other, and you're going to read about, how World War I starts, what happens in World War I, and what happens after World War I. So hopefully this all makes sense.